sola ecclesia, which your listeners might be able to find online somewhere, where I developed this idea that it's what was said for centuries up until more recent times, that no one has God as their father without the church as their mother. I mean, there are no single parent Christians. I mean, single parent family Christians. Every Christian has a mother, which is the church. Paul says it's the mother of all believers, to Jerusalem, which is above, in Galatians 6.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I'm sorry, Galatians 4.
Correct.
So we desperately need to get back. I mean, the rest of the world knows how silly we are as Americans, where we think that we can exist by ourselves. It took my generation of baby boomers to kind of seal the deal, but it's wrought a lot of harm on individual Christians, and it's also made the church weak and made our witness weak. And so when you sing these songs about Zion and Jerusalem, what you're talking about is God getting glory from this city. And the way Jesus mentions a city that has a light in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, we're a city which cannot be hidden. That's at least we're supposed to be. So that was another part of my purpose, Brandon, was just to try to get the people thinking about not being individualistic, because it's just a self-contradiction to think of an individualistic Christian. It just doesn't make sense in light of the Bible.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. And it's awesome how because I was thinking about Galatians, how Paul talks about the church, and he's referencing the Old Testament church to draw in the New Testament church. Because, I mean, they had no idea that this thing was going to blow up into what it is today, So all they knew was Jesus said go, and they just listened and went. So,
well, I think specifically of Matthew's gospel, but the early followers of Jesus, who were Jewish predominantly, there's Gentiles among them as well, but they were heavily criticized by the larger the Jewish religious leaders because they were not regarded as faithful Jews. Yet Jesus told his followers that they are the true heirs of the promises to Israel. And so there's a lot that needs sorted out there, both for the followers of Jesus to understand they are the heirs of God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so forth, and also to deal with the criticism they were getting as from the larger Jewish community. You see this, one of the principal places you see this is in the parable of the unjust stewards. I believe it's in all four Gospels, where Jesus talks about a vineyard. And this is clear reference to Israel, because it's Isaiah chapter 2. There's a song of the vineyard where God's talking about Israel. And when Jesus tells this parable, he says there were these stewards who were allowed to sharecrop the vineyard, and when it came time to give the owner his due, they refused to, and he sent servant after servant to collect his due, and they refused. They beat them up and so forth. And then he says, I'll send my son. Surely they'll listen to him. And it says, when they saw the son coming, they said, if we kill the son, the vineyard will be ours. Well, everybody knew what Jesus was talking about. He's talking about that. He's talking about the religious leaders who time after time after time rejected the prophets, even beat up and eventually killed the prophets. And now Jesus, as the son, is come to collect the rent. And they say, if we kill the son, the vineyard will be ours. But the result of that parable is Jesus says the vineyard is going to be taken away from them, that is, the religious leaders of Jesus' day, and be given to others who will bear the fruit. That's clearly a reference to Jesus' followers, because they received the Son. They honored the Son. And so this little cadre of followers of Jesus, and you can imagine what a freak show that was. I mean, the disciples and Zacchaeus, all these women and all these people who've been lame and blind and all this. Jesus in that parable essentially says what was promised to Old Testament Israel is now handed to you to be the stewards. And what did they do? They went out and bore witness to Jesus. And guess what?
Boom.
Gentiles started. Gentiles start, and this is what. And there's one thing I know we got to talk about, and that is this idea of replacement theology. That sometimes the view I'm espousing here, sometimes people say, "Oh, that's replacement theology." You're saying the church replaces Israel. That's the last thing I'm saying. I'm saying that the faithful Jewish followers of Jesus bore witness to Jesus, and guess what? The promise God made to Abraham came true.
Yeah.
I mean, Abraham's standing there looking at the stars, and if he becomes a blessing to the nations like God has promised, well, someday Jewish people are going to be a minority among God's people because all these nations are going to come.
Yeah.
And so thank God for the faithful Jewish followers of Jesus who bore witness and made people like you and me who are, we're the servants come lately to the vineyard. We get the same wage. So if anybody believes in replacement theology, they're wrong. But if they believe in the vine blossoming and bearing fruit, like Paul talks about, Romans 9-11 there, then that's what we're talking about here. That we are indebted forever to the Jewish people as those to whom the promises were made, and particularly those Jewish followers of Jesus who bore witness to Jesus as Messiah.
All right. Now,
crazy stuff.
Yeah, it is. It's a lot, but it's good stuff. Okay, for my next question, and this question is also out of your article or out of your essay, and I want you to answer it the best you can. So here it is. How is it that the New Testament church can sing so readily about itself from the Old Testament church?
Because in a simple way, to say it simply, what God intended for the people of God in the Old Testament represent is now in the process of being realized through the global followers of Jesus Christ.
Okay.
And so we're supposed to look back and see our family history in a sense. That as Christians who are part of the Church of Jesus Christ, we are to look back at the people of God in the Old Testament and see our family history, and sing the songs of Zion with those to whom they were first given, and that's what we do when we worship on the Lord's Day. We join those who are the saints triumphant in heaven, and one day in the new heavens and earth we'll all be together physically, resurrected, glorified. So it's good. It's like choir practice, Brandon.
Please don't sing.
Yeah, that God gave the gospel in the Old Testament. God gave the songs of the Psalms in the Old Testament, and properly understood and interpreted, those still preach the gospel to us. That's why we need to sing. That's particularly the Psalms we're talking about. There are hymns based on the Old Testament as well, but the gospel was preaching the Old Testament was preaching the gospel before Christ, about Christ who was to come, and that's why we need to both preach the gospel but also worship using the Old Testament as well as the New.
Okay, all right, that's a good one. Now I want to switch gears here, and I want to ask this other question. All right, and it's a two-part question, so bear with me. Why should the New Testament church aspire to the status of the Old Testament church? Or, in other words, city or mountain? Why should the New Testament church aspire to be like the Old Testament church?
Yeah, that's the second part.
Yeah, I changed the words.
Okay, all right. Well, we don't want to just try to go back and be that. We want to see in the Old Testament forms, the sacrifices, the offerings, the institutions, and so forth. We want to see in those things what God was pointing forward to, so that we will understand better what it is we have now, and also what is to come in the future. So if you look at the temple in the Old Testament, you see that there was a tree of life in the middle. It was a lampstand. We don't think of it as a tree, but it had blossoms engraved on it, and it gave light. So in some ways it mirrored back to creation, the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, and it pointed forward to the tree in the middle of the new heavens and earth. But when we look at, if we were to study, say, the book of Exodus and look at the tree, at the lampstand there, we would understand more about what John tells us in John chapter 1, that in him was life, and the light was the light. The life was the light of men. That Jesus is the true lampstand, the true tree of life. But then we are to be light bearers in the world. So you can look at the Old Testament tabernacle, for instance, or even the book of Leviticus about worship, and we see visual representations of what ultimately would become the people of God in the New Testament. So that another example, might be there's an incense altar in the design of the tabernacle in Exodus, starting at chapter 25 and going forward. Well, we don't bring incense as the Old Testament commanded, but we are told today that if you look at like Revelation 7, that the prayers of the people of God are like incense rising up to God's throne. So you can study the incense offerings and understand more about prayer.
Right.
You can certainly study the sacrifices of Leviticus and learn about what Christ would ultimately do. But then Paul in Romans 12 says, present your bodies as living and holy sacrifices. So we learn about how we are to worship God, not just what Christ has done for us, but how we are to present ourselves as living and holy sacrifices, acceptable and pleasing to God, by studying the Old Testament sacrifices themselves. And then one of my favorite, and this is a very big one, Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2 says that followers of Christ are living stones and a kingdom of priests and a house for God. So if you study the construction of the temple in 1 Kings 7 and 8, or if you look at the building of the tabernacle, again, in the book of Exodus, we understand more about who we are, number one, as living stones who are part of this. We are the new temple of God. Right. Because we're living stones, not dead stones. And we have a cornerstone, the rejected one, Jesus Christ. That's because of the Psalm 118 reference there in 1 Peter 2. And we're also a royal priesthood, a holy nation, and a people of God's own peculiar people or special treasure. It's translated different ways. So all these descriptions of the church in 1 Peter 2 are right out of the book of Exodus.
Yeah.
And so we understand more who we are. Like, what does a priest do? Well, a priest serves God, but a priest also serves others. Well, if the whole people of God are priests, they serve God, but who are the others that they serve? Well, one another, yeah, but I mean, Israel were to be priests to the nations. The Church of Jesus Christ, as a royal priesthood, is to administer God's grace to the nation, calling people to worship God, living as a holy people. And don't get me started on holiness, which is, Peter in 1 Peter 1, he quotes Leviticus 11, be holy as God is holy. So even the book of Leviticus is not left in the trash bin because of the new covenant. We certainly read it differently now that Christ has come, but it still has the gospel for us in it. So long answer to short question.
Hey guys, thank you for listening to this episode. We'll be right back after the break.
Hi, Hi, this is Christy Lundy with Bucket List Travels, specializing in faith-based trips. I work with a tour company that has over 40 years experience and over 40 itineraries to choose from. These trips are all inclusive and offer payment plans, making it a reality for most of your congregation to participate in. Your church family will bond with each other in a deep and meaningful way by experiencing these locations together. Bring the Bible to life by visiting these locations in which the accounts took place. Walk in the footsteps of Jesus, Old Testament